Okay, I think we'll get started. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to all. My name is Terry Sullivan. I'm a professor and senior fellow at the Institute for Health Policy Management Evaluation at the University of Toronto, and it's my privilege to be the moderator today of this webinar hosted by the Dalai Lama School of Public Health and the Institute for Health Policy Management and Evaluation as part of the school's COVID-19 webinar series. But before we start, let me acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of Indigenous people and remains home for Indigenous people across Turtle Island, which is this part of the country. We're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Here we are, and the world is anxiously awaiting the COVID-19 vaccine. There's an opportunity to recognize that the University of Toronto's rich history in vaccine production and distribution is shared with Connaught Laboratories, which is now Sanofi Pasteur, which you're going to hear a little bit more about in a moment. We're going to explore what vaccine makers have learned from previous infections, such as diphtheria, tetanus, polio, and smallpox, and the process behind the pursuit of an effective vaccine. Our three speakers today are leaders in academia, public health, and private industry, and will shed light on the pharmaceutical trajectory of new antivirus products, including COVID-19 vaccine, from development through testing and launch. So let me introduce them to you briefly. The first person I'd like to introduce is Mark Lievonen. Mark is a senior fellow at the Institute for Health Policy Management and Evaluation and former president of Sanofi Pasteur. And he'll tell us a little bit about the connection with Connaught Laboratories and the University of Toronto. But let me tell you a bit more about Mark. He's a 30-year veteran in the business. He basically brought what is now Sanofi Pasteur Connaught into a billion-dollar enterprise. And he has been very generous in supporting training of young scientists, 5,500 students, seeing opportunities through BioGenius Canada. And he has been very well recognized with Queen's Jubilee recognitions, an honorable doctorate from York, and a trifecta, a kind of being an Order of Canada recipient. So Mark has been an outstanding leader in the sector, and we'll come back to Mark as our principal communications in just a moment. Our second person is Professor Vivek Goel, who is a talented scholar in his own right with an extensive background in teaching, research, and university admin. He trained at medical training at McGill, and he did his second master's at Harvard University in biostatistics before returning back to join the University of Toronto in 1991. He was chair of the Department of Health Admin, now IHPME, for a period of time, 1999 to 2001. He then served as provost, a very significant role in the university, working as vice president and provost from 2004 to 8. He was a founding scientist at ISIS, continues to be an adjunct scientist there. Served as founding president of Public Health Ontario when it was first established, where we worked together closely. And he has extensive experience in governance in the university and in a host of organizations that I won't take you through, but I don't know how he manages to communicate this much with the many organizations that he is working with. Just as one example, he is vice chair of the board of the Canadian Institute for Health Information and is also on the board of the Institute for Cancer Research. Our last guest, Jeff Kwong, is the interim director of the University of Toronto Centre for Vaccine Preventable Disease. He's a professor at the Dalai Lama School of Public Health, a scientist at Public Health Ontario, a senior scientist at ISIS. He's an epidemiologist with a specialist in public health and preventive medicine, and is a practicing family physician. His interests are in infectious disease, particularly influenza, and vaccine preventable diseases, and his work really sits at the center between primary care and public health. So we're delighted to have these talented folks with us. And with that, I'm going to turn it over immediately to Mark to tell us a little bit about his experience and some reflections on where we're going and how we're going to get there. So, Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Terry. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be with you here today. And I'm going to talk about a few things. I want to talk briefly about the history of the relationship between Connaught Laboratories, what is now Sanofi Pasteur, and the University of Toronto. Talk about the impact of vaccines. Talk a little bit about COVID-19 vaccine development. And I'll end up with a couple of issues to think about. So the relationship goes way back in 1914. Dr. John Fitzgerald established a stable on Martin Avenue in Toronto. And on May 1st of that year, he received $500 from the president of the University of Toronto, Robert Falconer, and established what became the Connaught Medical Laboratories just 2 years down the road. So he started in Martin Avenue. He bled some horses, and from there he produced through that diphtheria antitoxin and subsequently tetanus antitoxin, which was used to treat patients. Diphtheria and tetanus were diseases that were just ravaging the countryside and the city of Toronto. So we began there. In 1917, Connaught established the farm, which is at Dufferin Steeles, and still exists there to this day. It's a 50+ acre site, and it is the hub of Sanofi Pasteur in Canada. It's a vaccine R&D and vaccine manufacturing complex. Over the years, as I mentioned, diphtheria and tetanus antitoxins and vaccines were developed. In the 1920s, Connaught commercialized insulin, which was discovered by Banting and Best and their colleagues. I won't go into the insulin story. We could save that for another day. And over the years, other vaccines were involved, such as polio. Connaught was involved with both the inactivated polio vaccine and the oral polio vaccine. And at one point was the only manufacturer in North America making those two types of polio vaccines. Worked with Jonas Salk. And I think we all know about the impact that polio vaccine has had on the world. We can think about the 50s when polio threatened us the way we think of this pandemic right now. And people were in iron lungs, and it was very contagious. And through the polio vaccine, we were able to make a significant impact. In fact, there's no more polio in North America and Europe, around the world. We're capable, actually, of eradicating polio from the face of the earth, but we have not done that yet. The one disease that we have eradicated from the face of the earth is smallpox. And that took a great effort from companies and industries. Connaught Labs played a key role. It's one of the smallpox vaccine suppliers. And it was really through government and groups like the World Health Organization and others that we were able to officially eradicate smallpox. And I said, that's the only vaccine that's been eradicated from the face of the earth. Connaught and the School of Hygiene at the University of Toronto had strong roots in the 1920s. You can see the picture behind Vivek is the original School of Hygiene building that was established. In addition to the facility at Dufferin Steeles, Connaught established a facility at Spadina Avenue, which is now the School of Architecture. So the University of Toronto and Connaught had a strong relationship from them right through till now. And there continues to be ongoing research collaborations between the two groups. One of the more recent success stories of Sanofi Pasteur and Connaught was the development of the 5-component acellular pertussis vaccine, which prevents whooping cough. And that product, in combination with others, has developed into $1 billion business. The product is manufactured at the site in Toronto, the Sanofi Pasteur site in Toronto, exported all over the world, and is the only example of $1 billion biotech product that's been developed, manufactured, and exported from Canada. That then brings us to the present and looking at a COVID-19 vaccine and what that might look like. There are 100+ candidates that are out there. There's been unprecedented collaboration that we hear about between companies, between governance, between companies and industry, everybody working together. I've never seen such cooperation and such spirit working together like that. And we hear promising timeframes. Now, I just want to take a minute to talk about the normal development stages for a vaccine. There's normally discovery work. Then there's preclinical testing, which can include animal models. Then there's 3 phases of clinical testing. Phase 1 is safety. Make sure that the candidate vaccine won't harm anybody. And remember, a large number of our vaccines are injected into healthy babies, so they have to be very, very safe. Phase 2 is safety and immunogenicity, and that's to make sure there's an immune response that's developed, that one can see that, and one will hope that that vaccine will work. And then phase 3 are the large-scale safety and efficacy trials. Does the vaccine actually work? Does it actually prevent disease? From there, you go to regulatory approval, and then market launch, which also includes phase 4 clinical trials, so that there's safety and monitoring. Now, if you put all that together, the normal time frame to develop a vaccine is 10 to 15 years and over $1 billion. So that's our normal time frame. The fastest that we've done is 4 to 5 years. That's the case with Ebola and mumps. And you will have heard everybody's talking about 12 to 18 months with this particular vaccine. And remember, the conversations first started in March. So we're talking about 12 to 18. We've even heard some comments from government officials, particularly in the US, about the end of this year, the beginning of next year. If we were to do that, that would be the first time we've ever done it. It would be a remarkable achievement. It could happen because of the cooperation that we've never seen before. But if we just step back for a minute and summarize, we're looking at what could be 12 to 18 months for a vaccine, 4 to 5 years, 10 to 15 years, or in fact, never. I mean, there are diseases for which we do not have vaccines. Hepatitis C, there was a very promising candidate vaccine. It went into phase 3 clinical trials. It did not work. And we have wonderful treatments for hepatitis C, but not vaccines. The same with HIV/AIDS. We do not have a vaccine for that yet. And if you look at tuberculosis, which kills more people than any other infectious disease on the face of the earth right now, well, we have a BCG vaccine. It's not that effective, and we truly have not been able to develop an effective vaccine against that. So I would say each of those scenarios are possible, and we need to think about what scenario will occur and what's the likelihood that it could occur. And those are things I think that policymakers and all of us have to reflect upon going forward. The last 2 points I would make kind of under other potential issues, we need to think about manufacturing, and manufacturing is a whole other activity in itself. That takes 4 to 5 years, hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, I am encouraged to see companies and groups make at-risk investments in vaccine plants. You've heard people talk about investments before we even have a vaccine. Again, that's unheard of. That's very optimistic, and it's tremendous to see, but that certainly needs to be taken into consideration. And then there will be issues around distribution and allocation, which I think Jeff will talk about in more detail. And finally, things to think about are vaccine hesitancy. If we get a vaccine, will in fact some people not want to take it up, which we've seen in other vaccines. And again, Jeff will talk on that. And the last point I would make, and we may even have to think about, how do we live without a vaccine? Because that clearly is a potential scenario. So I think I'll stop there and be ready for questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm going to go to Dr. Goel and then to Dr. Kwong, and then we're going to have an opportunity for a bit of interaction and some open discussion. So Vivek, do you want to proceed?
Thanks, Terry, and it's great to be part of this discussion with the Dell Atlantic School of Public Health. So as Mark noted, the picture I have behind me is the School of Hygiene building. Chris Ruddy has posted some links in the Q&A, and in fact, the picture is actually taken from his Connaught website, and so thank you, Chris, for all your archival work over the years. He has done histories of the Connaught Labs for the university, for the school, and for Sanofi, and is working with us right now on the 100th anniversary of insulin, which we're about to enter into. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things. One, I just want to pick up on the sort of open science approach and the collaboration that we're seeing that Mark mentioned, and how that relates to a number of other sort of policy issues that we've been facing as a country and as an institution. And then I also want to talk a little bit about the role of government in sort of thinking about the national vaccination strategy, as well as the thoughts that we have to start to work on. And hopefully this will set up for the comments that Jeff will make in a little bit more depth. So, you know, we talk a lot these days about open science and collaboration, but I like to say that, you know, the School of Hygiene and the Connaught Labs, John Fitzgerald and the work that he did actually was a paradigm that people are just catching up to around the rest of the world now. In terms of sharing what they did, being open about what they were doing, and many of the great achievements that Mark referred to around a number of vaccines, as well as the sharing of insulin, were really based on that philosophy. While they didn't use the terms open science, they certainly did practice it. And you know, one little comment about the philosophy that John Fitzgerald had, and you know, the history of the Connaught Labs is titled "Health Within Reach of Everyone," and his motivation, which he described later in life, was an experience that he had as a practicing physician with diphtheria antitoxoid, which at the time was very expensive and had limited supply in Canada. Was coming in from the United States. And he recalls the story of visiting a family with 2 children who could only afford 1 dose. And so the parents actually had to step aside and pick which of their kids would live and which would die. And that's what led him to build that stable that Mark referred to, so we could start to manufacture here in Canada and at an affordable price. And so putting health within reach of everyone. Similarly with insulin, it was provided in a way that ensured that it could reach people at a reasonable price. And very importantly, the University of Toronto created an insulin committee that also ensured the quality of what was produced around the world. There was no FDA or Health Canada regulation, so they actually set it up so that it could be distributed around the world at a reasonable price and high quality. They created a concept of a patent pool, which we continue to have reports calling for national patent pools that were the improvements that were made by companies that held the license to use the original University of Toronto patents had to be put back into the patent pool and were shared amongst everyone. And that was maintained until the original patents ran out. So, you know, you might ask the question, well, what happened to the Connaught Labs, and why did they become part of Sanofi Pasteur and an international conglomerate? So, you know, as with everything else through the post-war period, 50s and 60s, and globalization essentially, the University of Toronto could not support being an international vaccine manufacturer. The capital expenditures required to upgrade those facilities that Mark referred to were simply ones that the university could no longer make. And so at that time, the university had to sell the labs. And there were a number of series of transactions before it wound up being part of Sanofi Pasteur as we know it today. The benefit for us is the Connaught Fund, which you know, I'm looking at the participant list. There's many people who are on this webinar who have benefited from investments from the Connaught Fund, and including most recently our Toronto COVID Action Fund that we've now invested close to $10 million. The seed investment of that was actually from the Connaught Fund. So we obviously benefited as an institution, but we did not, were not able to stay in the game of being a global manufacturer of vaccines as a university. I think, again, the lesson for us as we're having these debates right now about what has happened to our manufacturing capacity for drugs, for vaccines, for critical supplies that we need, I think we're going to probably come back and start to have these discussions about why don't we have our own Canadian capacity in a number of these areas. It doesn't mean that the university should be doing it, but I think those same forces of globalization have affected us in a number of ways. So as Mark said, there's an incredible degree of sharing happening with COVID-19. And one of the things I just reflect on is since January, when the genomes of the virus were first developed, they've been shared broadly. Virus samples have been shared. And I've not seen the kinds of issues that we saw during SARS, where we had people patenting viruses. We even had that during H1N1. So we do have sharing happening. We've been able to develop the diagnostic tests and distribute them very quickly. And we're seeing largely a very collaborative effort underway in terms of the search for a vaccine. And the major manufacturers have all agreed to share their work. And they've also agreed, as I understand it, that whoever gets there first, they're all going to collaborate and proceed to manufacturing together so that as many doses can get out as rapidly as possible. We do have to be concerned about, and one of the comments I had, and I see it's already coming up in some of the comments in the chat, is that this not turn into a geopolitical arms race. And south of the border, we're starting to see some of that. We have to maintain that commitment to a global sort of strategy. And we don't wind up in a situation where one company winds up dominating the market. I think with the collaboration we're seeing, I don't think that's likely amongst the major suppliers, but we could still have the situation that a smaller manufacturer is the first who does not share those commitments. I do really share Mark's comments about being realistic about the timelines and about the outcomes. Even if we have a vaccine, it may only be partially efficacious. It may have limited duration of immunity. There may be challenges with how we deliver it. We might have to have multiple doses. So I think there's a little bit of magical thinking, and this is probably a separate webinar that we are going to be able to sort of hold in the state that is being described as phase 3 until a vaccine is realized. It may well be in 12 months, but it could be much longer. And then I think, as Jeff will get into, rolling out a vaccination program on the scale that will be required is going to take even a few more years. So I'll just close by talking about what governments should be thinking about right now. And, the first thing I'll just reflect, I was at Public Health Ontario when we had to roll out the immunization campaign during H1N1. And that built on the seasonal influenza campaign. The timing was right, and we were able to utilize the infrastructures as they existed for it. But it was still challenging to do in the timeframes that we had. And so the first thing, again, this is probably a topic for another webinar, is we have to deal with our federal, provincial, territorial issues. The federal government will be responsible for ensuring we have a safe vaccine, for trying to negotiate it in an affordable way. And we'll have our challenges in getting enough supply for Canada. And the provinces and territories will have the responsibility for delivering it. And Jeff will speak a little bit more to what that's going to be involved. But there's huge logistics. And we better start the planning and the coordination across the levels of government about that now. And how we govern such a program, making sure we have clear goals for what we want to achieve and what time frames, because we're not going to be able to get to all Canadians at the levels that we will need in a short time frame. And as Mark referred, we're going to have to be setting the priorities, and we need to have to start the conversations now about what the sequencing is going to look like. I'll just close with my reflection. In the early weeks of the H1N1 campaign, there were headlines of sports players, Toronto Maple Leafs getting vaccine, or the Medcan private clinics having the doses before we had populations at highest risk being able to get it. And so if we don't start thinking those through, those issues now and having some of the difficult ethical discussions around prioritization. Doing them once we have the doses available will be too late. So I'll pass on to Jeff at this stage.
Thank you, Vivek. Jeff.
Great. Thanks, Terry. Thanks, Vivek, and Mark for the great introductions. And so what I'm going to talk about is, based on, some of the experiences that I had, from the H1N1 pandemic in 2009 and my speculations of what's going to happen if and when we get a vaccine here. So I'm going to mainly be talking about the delivery issues, as well as some of the data collection issues, which, I think are important, and I think might not be on the minds of a lot of people at this time, at least. So, I think there's a lot of considerations that need to be, taken into account, when we're planning a vaccination program. Some of them are going to depend on the supply. How many doses will be available per week? In the early days of the H1N1 vaccination campaign, we were limited to only a certain number of doses. And so, it was decided that public health would be administering the vaccine, and they would control it closely. And then later, when there was more supply, then they allowed family doctors to also be administering it, partly because there was too much demand in public health and they weren't able to handle the volumes at that point. Other considerations include like characteristics of the vaccine. How many doses are going to be needed to, lead to immunity? Is it just going to be one dose, or are multiple doses going to be needed for immunity? What are the cold chain requirements? And, does it need to be kept just, at fridge temperature? Does it need to be frozen? Is it an injectable vaccine? Or are there, or alternative delivery methods such as intranasal vaccine, like with the flu mist or the live attenuated influenza vaccine? Or will it be a different delivery method? So all of these are unknowns at this point, but they'll have an impact on how the vaccine will be delivered. Vivek touched on the issue of priority populations. Is our goal to minimize morbidity and mortality, or is it to minimize transmission in the population? Because who we vaccinate first will depend on the goals of the program. It will also be determined by things like, how much, what are the incidence rates or, infection rates going on at the time that the vaccine is available? Are there still like lots of infections happening? And that will influence the demand for the vaccine, as well as other characteristics like, how well does this vaccine, perform in the clinical trials? Is it like a highly efficacious vaccine or a not so efficacious vaccine? Because people may say, well, if it's not that effective, then I'm not going to bother getting it, versus if it's very effective, then more people will be interested. And so this, also, leads into the issue of vaccine hesitancy. And I think, so issues like effectiveness and safety are going to be high on people's minds to, for people who are not sure if they should get the vaccine. So it'll be important for, the government to fund social marketing campaigns to encourage vaccination, the importance of protecting, people vaccinated as well as those around them, as we do for influenza vaccines. And then also in this day and age, it's important to engage people via social media, especially those who are vaccine hesitant. Now social media, having a large social media presence is really important for, influencing the population. Next, the issue of administration. Who should be administering the vaccine? Should it be the local public health units, running mass immunization clinics, or should it be primary care clinics like physicians and nurses, or should it be pharmacies? Right now with our seasonal influenza vaccination program, we use a mix of different providers. So the three that I mentioned already, as well as workplace clinics, clinics and schools. So all of these may be in play, especially if we're trying to vaccinate as many people as quickly as possible. But there's trade-offs with each one of them. For instance, public health may still be busy with the pandemic response, activities such as contact tracing. Will they have any staff available to help deliver the vaccine? They may be just in charge of distributing the vaccine. So what will happen is the province will receive the doses, they'll send it to the local public health units, and then maybe the local health units will send it to primary care clinics and pharmacists for distribution, for actually the administration in those locations. It might make sense to use the established infrastructure that we have in place for, giving seasonal influenza vaccines. So, family doctors are very used to giving vaccines, and there's like tens of thousands, there's 10,000 family doctors in the province. So I think we should probably use that infrastructure for delivering, a coronavirus vaccine. And what's helpful is that they know their patients, so they can help to identify the priority populations and ensure that it gets to the priority populations more effectively. The trade-off is that some people don't have family doctors, and then perhaps they could be going to the pharmacies, and the pharmacists can step in for those patients who don't have family physicians. And the next issue I want to talk about is data collection. So it's really critical that we capture the administration of every single dose that's given. And I think this was one of the issues with the H1N1 vaccine, was that there was kind of all over the place how this was captured. It wasn't captured in a very systematic way, and there was no central repository for us to know, who received the vaccine, in the overall picture. And so I think it's really important to have this so that we can monitor vaccine coverage, we can monitor vaccine safety, as well as the effectiveness of the vaccine. So for instance, if there are any safety concerns of the vaccine, if we have a database where we, of all the people who've received the vaccine, we can notify those who've received perhaps a certain lot number, that we can then contact them and notify them to monitor for symptoms or side effects. And we do have some immunization information systems in place. So we have a system called Panorama, and but right now there's no interfaces with the family doctors' electronic medical records or with pharmacies. And so I think now is the time to start setting these things up, to setting up the information infrastructure, so that whoever is giving the vaccine can then record it electronically, and then these can be shared between all the potential providers. And so that's what a registry is. It's like one central place where all the information is stored, so we can look up people, did they receive a dose, how many weeks ago, do they need a second dose if another dose is needed. Another potential application is the Can Immunize app, where it's kind of like an electronic version of the yellow card, which is like the immunization record. And so, a lot of Ontarians have started to have downloaded that app, and maybe we can use it so, to capture the receipt of a COVID vaccine, and we can have it interface with the other, like the immunization registry that I mentioned. And so, I think what happened with H1N1, there were some public health units that used databases and they captured the information electronically, and there were others who used paper consent forms. And I was involved in a study where we were trying to look at the association between H1N1 vaccine and a condition called narcolepsy. And so for some health units, we were able to look in the databases to see if certain individuals, like either the ones who had narcolepsy or some control individuals, had received the H1N1 vaccine. And in other health units, we had to go through boxes, like literally boxes and boxes of paper consent forms to try to see if a specific list of individuals had received the H1N1 vaccine. So I hope that we'll never have to do that exercise again, and that we'll have every dose given available in electronic format and searchable in a single database, rather than
Are you there, Deb?
Might have lost his connection.
Yeah. Well, let's hope he joins back in a moment. Vivek, you raised this point, so just as a little conversational piece while we wait for Jeff to finalize, what is your thought on governance as somebody who's involved in a lot of governance? How is this whole show supposed to unfold?
So,
I know it's not your responsibility, but what is the role of the federal government, the provincial government, the regional public health structures? How does one put a chaotic kind of organization into a more disciplined kind of focus to be able to just deliver the doses required that will be required at a time when we have the vaccine in our hands?
So, I think there's a much bigger aspect of that, because it's obviously important for delivering the immunization program, but it's also what we're living in terms of the response to any of these public health situations. And that is the split in powers between the federal government and the province and territory. So I've often said, when asked what's the biggest threat to the health of Canadians, the Constitution Act of Canada, because it creates this split in powers. That's why we can't get information systems, why we don't have counts of how many deaths there are, because the largest province isn't reporting in a timely manner to StatsCan. Like, until we actually deal with that fundamental issue that when the BNA Act was written, the world did not look like it does today, and the powers that were put on one level or the other were split in ways that don't make sense today. So, we have to have a governance model that brings the provinces and territories and the federal government together with a clear set of accountabilities. There are models for doing things you mentioned. I'm on the vice chair of the board of CIHI, is I think an example of an organization that works in the federal, provincial, territorial space with deputy ministers on its governance body, as well as people from the community governing the health information. Certainly there's a lot more to be done. So I think in the public health space, we need to think of a model like that, and perhaps getting ready for the mass immunization campaign is a way to get, and I think some of those conversations actually are happening amongst the deputies right now, I believe, in terms of they know they cannot prepare for this under the ways in which we've done it in the past.
Very good. It is now just about 22:01. I wonder if we put one or two final questions to our panelists, and then we'll open up for questions that are online already. So, Mark, maybe you could talk a little bit about the challenge of manufacturing, how we're going to do that. What is our capacity, if any, within our jurisdiction to be able to make that happen?
Yeah, I think there's a number of elements that come in that question. First of all, manufacturing traditional vaccines is a challenge. It's difficult to do. The regulatory standards and quality assurance standards are extremely high. And in fact, if you're manufacturing traditional or existing vaccines right now, that's a core competency. And those who manufacture well and supply win. That tends to be the case. So now we're talking about a new vaccine. As I mentioned before, to build a new facility typically would take 4 to 5 years, and to bring it on stream. If you have an existing site like the Sanofi Pasteur campus in Toronto, or any other vaccine manufacturing campus in Canada or around the world, that site is already licensed for vaccines. So if you were to build a new facility with fermenters and bioreactors, you'd be able to license that in conjunction with the other activities that are there, such as quality control and all the other testing that has to be done. If you're talking about a greenfield site, now you're talking about building manufacturing capacity and quality control testing and all the infrastructure and all the utilities. And that's just another very significant activity to put in place. These things do cost hundreds of millions of dollars, take years. And so that's there no matter what we do with the vaccine. So I am encouraged, as I mentioned, that all sorts of money is being invested right now. People are looking at how they can fast track it. That is tremendous. We are knowing that we need hundreds of millions of doses. So to produce hundreds of millions of doses or billions of doses to protect the world at large, will need significant investments, more than one site. That's one of the reasons everybody's hoping for and wishing there's more than one successful vaccine, because this can't be a winner take all. It's going to be a number of successful ventures, vaccines that venture forth, and that there are facilities to go with them. So the manufacturing and challenges and scale-up issues are just as significant as the actual vaccine discovery, development, and regulatory approval issues. There will be challenges, and they will go hand in hand. There's no doubt, which again just gets back to the optimism when I hear in 12 to 18 months we could have a vaccine and hundreds of millions of doses. That is wonderful. It's also unheard of, and I hope we get there, but it may take somewhat longer than that.
Thank you, Mark. So I think we have to come back to Jeff here, because I think we lost you briefly, and I don't know if you'd finished your comments before we move on to a discussion with the folks online. Can you hear me, Jeff? I think he's a little frozen there. Okay, Nicole, I think we should go to questions and see what we've got here. Here's a good question, anonymous attendee. What are your thoughts on SARS-CoV-2 mutating as it spreads over time through the population? What will that mean for the production of a vaccine? Will it make it more difficult? Is it going to be a race to keep track with it? What are our thoughts?
I mean, I'm happy to start that, and then Mark, you might want to add in. Certainly, if a virus changes, it does make vaccine production more difficult. And I think it's one of the reasons why creating a vaccine for HIV has been more challenging. So to date, there's, I think, less evidence that this virus mutates that rapidly. But there are certainly different, I think, strains starting to develop. So that, we're still, we have to just keep reminding ourselves, we're less than 6 months since this virus started. There's a lot of knowledge and research about it, but there's still a lot left to learn about it. And I think, there's another, maybe we can deal with, there's another sort of related question from Russell's son in terms of, will one vaccine be effective for every country, or as it mutates, might we need different strains? And absolutely, like if it starts to vary, we may need different vaccines. And if it varies over seasons, then we may wind up with something like seasonal flu, where we need to revaccinate every year. And then with the different genetics in individuals, again, I think there may be different populations with different risks. And I think that's also why it's important to have different manufacturers and different sort of scientific methodological approaches to the vaccines, as we have for other diseases. Sometimes there's a vaccine type that's more effective in one population or one scenario than another. And so we may well need to have multiple vaccines.
Yeah, just to add a few points, really emphasizing points that Vivek made. I mean, our experience is not that long with this, and we really don't know what we don't know. So that is one of the key factors. People have reported that they think that this virus will mutate slowly. And again, that could change, but that if we did have a candidate vaccine, it might be good for 2 or 3 years before mutations occur that cause a difficulty. I do think of the seasonal flu vaccine, where we do have the experience where the strains change. We identify which are the most likely strains. That's a bit of a guessing game. What strains do we think will be the most likely? But then our system is well geared up. Once those strains have been identified and approved, vaccine manufacturers are very good at producing those strains through processes that have been licensed and doing clinical trials that are able to turn it around in a year. So it may be that this virus is like that. It may be that it does change and we have seasonal variations. All of those things, I think, remain to be seen.
I noticed there was a comment, thank you, Mark, a comment from Jolene Way. asking about the variation in the vaccine, but also about, is there, how does one see, given the chaos we have in our own country, and I don't want to sound discouraging, but how do we actually distribute vaccine around the world in lower and middle income countries who are going to have a harder time accessing the vaccine, distributing it and delivering it and so on. So I don't know, Vivek, if you want to comment on that, or Mark, do you have any experience?
So, I think this is going to be a really important, again, discussion. And again, I think there's another one from Rob Steiner around the undermining of the WHO, because I think if we really were taking a global perspective on this, we would want to have our priorities clear on which populations should get the vaccine first as it's being manufactured, because we're not going to be able to make enough global doses all at once. And so just like we need the conversation within Canada or within each province, we should really be having that global conversation. And I think if we had a forum for that kind of conversation, we had a rational process, we probably want to get it to many low and middle income countries first, because the impact of the disease and the fact that they don't have the public health systems and the health system responses that we might have, it'll actually be better for the world to get it to some of those countries first, right? Unfortunately, I think we know from a realistic perspective, and Donald Trump has already said the first 380 million doses are going to go to the US population, regardless of need. So I don't have an answer on that, but I think, again, these are conversations I don't actually see us having. I think the WHO, publicly, I think the WHO has been having these conversations, but I think the rhetoric towards the WHO, and so the focus there is really about what they did back in January or March or so on, as opposed to all the great work that they're doing on prioritizing vaccine candidates, trying to coordinate the work, and trying to lay the basis towards how we would run a global campaign is getting lost in the noise.
Yeah, I'll just add, I do have some practical experience with this going back to the H1N1, where we had a main flu vaccine supplier for Canada. GSK had a facility in Quebec, and Pasteur Mérieux at the time, Sanofi Pasteur, had a major flu facility in the US. We worked hard at putting a proposal to say that 10% of those doses could be allocated to Canada with a legal agreement, binding agreement. There would be some upfront funds and contractual commitments put in place, and was quite convinced at the time that that would be a good backup supply for vaccine. As we fast forward, and Vivek just mentioned it, I think the borders have gone up more than ever. We see that particularly with the discussions emanating from the US initially, but now in Europe and around. And I think this whole issue of allocation of vaccines and supply is another extremely challenging one. And as for Canada, I think it's a matter of looking at how do we secure those vaccine doses, whether it's agreements with manufacturers, whether it's trying to put in our own sources of supply, the allocation of what population should get it first, both around the world in terms of countries and in terms of risk populations. These are going to be very meaty issues to be tackled and addressed. We need some really smart minds working on it. The solutions won't be easy, but I think we need to start thinking and addressing them now. So now, if we think about it, there's a challenge in getting a vaccine, there's a challenge in manufacturing the vaccine, and then there's a challenge in allocation, and then followed by administration. So there's lots of things to think about and work through here.
A many-layered challenge. I see Rob Steiner here as a very interesting and pragmatic question, which you sort of started out with, Mark. Let's presume it takes a little longer than it's supposed to take. What do we need to be focusing on with respect to social distancing? How do we deal with the new normal? And how do we look at, I hesitate to say regulate, but find ways in which we can actually enforce protection as we move forward, again, on the assumption that it may take a little longer than 18 months to have a robust vaccine in place.
I'm happy to start off on that one, Terry.
It was directed to you.
Yeah, I see that question to Vivek. Okay, so yeah, I'll again just say that I'm actually very concerned that our overall policy response to this pandemic is not what pandemic plans actually were meant to do. When you get to this stage of global spread, and when we moved from containment to mitigation, which I think was when the WHO declared the pandemic around the first week of March, you're no longer trying to avoid every single case. You're trying to mitigate the impact of the virus. But we're still holding out that every case has to be avoided. And it's not going to be possible for us to manage, because I think as Rob is saying, we're gonna, if we have to maintain a 6-foot separation, there's all sorts of parts of society that cannot come back. This is why many universities are moving some or all of their courses, including ours, for the fall to online. It's simply not possible to function. Sports events, restaurants will likely go under if they have to maintain these things. So we have to actually have a conversation about what the acceptable level of risks are. And there we have to really start to look at the data. We do have, unfortunately, people that are dying from COVID-19. But if you look at the numbers carefully, virtually all of the deaths are in people who have pre-existing conditions that put them at higher risks, that are older. And in younger adults who don't have pre-existing conditions, the death rate is actually very low, and the proportion that are hospitalized and put on ventilators. So, I think it's a very difficult conversation to have. And the longer our politicians continue to promise that we have to avoid every single case of disease, the harder it becomes for us to back ourselves out of it. So Premier Legault in Quebec about a month ago actually made comments about we have to get back to life, and we have to be prepared to accept that there will be some cases. And he got hammered in the media, and his popularity plummeted in Quebec. He was at the top of the premiers for his initial response, and for having said what is really the truth, he got hammered. And so I despair because I think we're not on a track that will enable us to survive as a society until there is this hypothetical vaccine. And that's why I refer to that as magical thinking, that it's the vaccine that gets us out of this.
Welcome back, Jeff. We're very, very close to closing off, but we probably have time for 1 or 2 more comments. There's a very specific question here from Chris Bonnet about who should be funding the vaccine. This is back to federal provincial arrangements here. And again, any thoughts about this, Jeff? I don't know, how has it worked in the past? Are you there?
Yeah, I think it's reasonable for the federal government to be, funding, in partnership with industry for developing a vaccine. I'm not sure that any one entity alone will be able to do it, right? So I don't think it's reasonable to expect it all to be government or all to be industry. And I think it's, it's something where we're all in this together, and I think we have to work together on this, which is what's happening right now. Governments around the world are working together with, industry partners from around the world. So I think it's all a collective effort right now.
We will hope that is the case, and that goodwill will prevail. Question about who is leading. You may want to comment on this, Vivek or Mark. The question about who is actually leading the brigade. It turns out there's a lot of people leading. Mark, do you want to comment on that?
I guess leading the brigade, everybody seems to want to. If you're talking about vaccine development in particular, one would imagine the large companies like GSK and Sanofi and Merck and Pfizer, J&J, who are out there, Moderna and other ones. As I say, it's amazing to see the cooperation between them, which is really important, but also to see the academic and institutional labs who are coming forth with vaccine candidates. In my world, collaborations between companies and the time it takes to make an agreement and the risk-averse nature of that can go on and on and on, but things seem to be happening very quickly. I think, politicians are right in there as well, and scientific officials. Everybody's cheerleading and everybody's pronouncing when we might get there, and everybody has an optimistic view, and that's great to see. It's great to see the optimism and the collaboration, which as I say, is unprecedented. Hopefully it will all work out in as quickly a time frame as possible.
One final question, which is sort of an imponderable, but it's back to, there's a question here from Lynn. What happens if we don't have a working vaccine within the next few years?
I'll just note, and there's a few other questions here about developing natural immunity, and I actually have to ring off in about 3 minutes to get onto the immunity task force that I'm part of, that has been supported by the federal government. And so, that is the other aspect to this is, first of all, establishing whether there is immunity amongst people who've had previous COVID-19 disease, and then what the degree and duration of that immunity is. Is there cross-immunity to other viruses? If you look at the geographical distribution around the world and what's happened in some different countries, and this comment is about some countries having done really well, but it may also be that there was cross-immunity in some of those populations from other similar viruses. So our task force has been supported by the federal government and is collaborating with the provinces on, first of all, getting a program of research on establishing whether there is immunity. And then second, getting a set of studies going that will look at how many people have had COVID-19 infection using serology that measures antibodies to the virus. And some of that work is actually already starting using existing blood specimens through a variety of sources. And then there's going to be some prospective studies. There's also going to be work that will look at different populations, healthcare workers, homeless populations, the indigenous, so on. So over the course of the next 6 months to a year, a lot of data is going to be generated to start to inform that side of the public health response, because in the absence of getting a vaccine, we have to figure out how we get natural immunity, and if so, how we get to that in a reasonable way.
Terrific. Very positive and optimistic point on which to close. So with that, thanks to our guests for joining us today, with Mark, Vivek, and Jeff, and thanks to everybody who joined us online. And last but not least, thanks to Nicole for keeping us on track here with respect to the communications and technology. Thank you very much, and enjoy the sunshine.
Thanks. Bye now.
Bye.